For all of you folks who are going, but how come President Trump isn't invoking the Insurrection Act yet? And what you need to realize is the Insurrection Act is able to be used once we have a showing that the states are unable, or they fail, or they refuse to protect a constitutional right. And what you're seeing play out right now with all this drama in the Arizona legislature and the Pennsylvania and the Georgia legislatures and the courts in these states is you're seeing the states struggle with whether they're going to be able to rise to the occasion. And either they will or they won't. By the way, insurrection, if you're not familiar with the term, because it's not something we talk about in daily life, even I don't, is basically a rebellion of the citizens of a country against the government. So say China sends in a bunch of spies or foot soldiers to surround the White House and try to overthrow the White House, and we've got turncoat American citizens who decide to try to help out and take out the sitting president. That would be an insurrection. We've got people rising up in our own country trying to unseat our government. And the president would be well within his rights to invoke this act to quell that insurrection at that point in time. And my question for you is it any different if China doesn't send actual foot soldiers in, but does that by way of a keyboard, and there are people in this country helping them? I think the answer is there isn't a difference. It's a difference without a distinction. I don't think there's a difference there. But going back to what the text says of the Insurrection Act, whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions or rebellion against the authority of the U.S. make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the U.S. in any state, by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings, the president may call into federal service the use of the armed forces as he considers necessary to enforce those laws or suppress the rebellion. Specifically, the president, again I'm quoting now, by using the armed forces or by any other means, shall take such measures as he considers necessary to suppress any insurrection or conspiracy, if that insurrection or conspiracy so hinders the execution of the laws of the state that any part or class of its people in that state, right, are deprived of a right named in the Constitution. Well, what are rights named in the Constitution? The right to vote, right? And the constituted authorities of that state are unable, or they fail, or they refuse to protect that right. And again, what is the right? The right to vote. In any of these situations that I just enumerated, the state shall be considered to have denied the equal protection of laws secured by the Constitution. Now, I want you to replay what you've been hearing on the media channels regarding Giuliani and some of the other cases that have been filed in recent weeks. They've been brought on equal protection grounds. And we see them saying things like, oh, it's not fair. If the citizens in one county had votes that were counted this way and the citizens in a neighboring county, didn't have the votes counted that way, it denied equal protection. There's equal protection issues there. Well, is that a good judicial challenge? Is it a good argument to make to a court? Yeah. But what else does that argument do? It tracks the language I just read you out of the Insurrection Act. All right, so most recently this act was used, in case you're not familiar, to suppress the Rodney King riots. Back when I was in law school, hopped off the freeway driving through LA and found myself face to face with a tank full of U.S. Army clad folk. And that was our military on the streets of our country suppressing under the Insurrection Act that had been invoked, the uprising. You also saw it during the days of the desegregation and the fact that the southern schools were not integrating. So we sent troops to those southern schools to forcibly integrate the schools in the South when the governments of those states refused to do it back in the, a few decades ago in the 60s. And then prior to that, you saw this playing out during the Civil War. And the interesting thing about the military, once you call it the military and put it in the saddle, is they have their own separate system for judicial things. It's called military tribunals. And you may be interested to know that our government has in fact used those types of military tribunals in the past against American citizens who were involved in a plot to overthrow the United States president. And that was Abraham Lincoln. And they took the co-conspirators who were involved in that plot to take out Lincoln, and they tried them in military tribunals. And they justified their actions by pointing to the military nature of the conspiracy and the fact that the defendants had acted as enemy combatants, right? They got death by hanging and life in prison, in case you're curious. They got death by hanging and life in prison, in case you're curious. They got death by hanging and life in prison, in case you're curious. So what did we see in an executive order in September of 2018? We saw our president declare a national emergency to deal with a threat. And what was that threat? The threat of interference in our elections by foreign nationals, potentially using digital means and people in our country to help, right? And he termed that an unusual and an extraordinary threat to national security that warranted a declaration of national emergency. And now we see that the vote may have indeed been swayed. So I think those are things to sort of think with. I also want to talk to you about a couple of amendments you may not be familiar with. We've got the 14th Amendment, which, if you're not familiar, whole separate side door into the House here, says when the right to vote in any election for the choice of electors for president of the U.S. is denied to any inhabitant of a state, the basis of the representation therein shall be reduced proportionally, basically. So they can start stripping electoral votes if they find that that occurred. Something to think about, right? 12th Amendment, if nobody gets to a clear majority, if nobody gets over 270, we have the fact that the votes will be taken by the states and the representation from each state will have one vote. And of course, Republicans would be ahead in that count. So for all of you folks who are going, but how come President Trump isn't invoking the Insurrection Act yet? And what you need to realize is the Insurrection Act is able to be used once we have a showing that the states are unable, or they fail, or they refuse to protect a constitutional right. What you're seeing play out right now with all this drama in the Arizona legislature and the Pennsylvania and the Georgia legislatures and the courts in these states is you're seeing the states struggle with whether they're going to be able to rise to the occasion, and either they will or they won't. Like today, the court in Georgia didn't. And it may be because those courts just don't have the mettle needed to do what needs to be done. These are extraordinary times. But I can tell you something. The judges who are sitting in military tribunals, I believe, are cut from a vastly different cloth than the guys you see sitting on the regular courts here in the United States. So we're in the middle of that right now, and I would encourage you to not get overly wrapped up in the machinations of any 1 hour or 1 day. Just take a deep breath, and the biggest thing you can do right now is stay the course. And the second and most equal important thing you can do is show up. I am going to be speaking on the steps of the United States Supreme Court this Saturday at a huge Trump rally at 10 a.m. Rally's going to go all day. As I mentioned at the outset, this is a war, and you are in it, whether you realize you're in it or not. And you have a choice. You have a choice this weekend and every day, really, but especially this weekend, to show up for the man that is standing between tyranny and communism and freedom, or to sit on the couch and eat Fritos and look back 3 months from now and wish you had shown up. This is history in the making. And the outcome of it could not be more important, guys. It is going to determine the rest of your entire damned life. It's $100 flight into Washington, D.C. Come help history be made instead of just watching it from the couch.